After her trillionaire mother died in Montgomery, Alabama, Nicole Bannon's husband divorced her in a driveway and married her elder sister before the funeral flowers had wilted. They thought they'd humiliated a grieving daughter with nothing left to lose. What they didn't know was that the woman kneeling in that white dress, packing her life into cardboard boxes, had just inherited an empire built to operate in absolute silence. What happened next will make you rethink everything you believe about patience, power, and the devastating cost of underestimating a quiet woman. Before we go any further, let me just say, my beautiful family and friends, welcome back. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, do me a quick favor, hit that like button. Why? Because each like tells YouTube this story is worth sharing with more people who might really need it today. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I do read every single one, and it makes me feel like we're sitting together in the same room, sharing these moments heart to heart. And don't forget to share this video with someone you love. You never know, the story you share might be the encouragement they've been praying for. Most importantly, if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss a story when it drops. This isn't just a channel, it's a family. And when you engage, you're helping us build a safe space where real stories bring real hope. Now, let's begin. There are moments in life that don't ask permission. They don't wait for you to be ready. They simply arrive, uninvited, and split your world into before and after. For Nicole Bannon, that moment came on a humid April afternoon in Montgomery, Alabama, the day her mother's heart stopped beating in a sterile hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and unfinished goodbyes. Eleanor Bannon had been a quiet woman. Reserved. Private. The kind of mother who attended church socials and volunteered at literacy programs but never drew attention to herself. She dressed modestly, drove a 10-year-old sedan, and lived in a comfortable but unremarkable home on the east side of the city. What no one knew, what Nicole herself didn't fully understand until later, was that Eleanor Bannon had been playing a much longer, much quieter game. But on that April day, all Nicole knew was grief. The wedding had been scheduled for the following Saturday. Nicole's dress, a flowing white gown with lace sleeves, still hung in her childhood bedroom. The shoes sat unworn in their box. The invitations had been mailed. The caterer confirmed. The florist paid in full. And then Eleanor collapsed in the kitchen while making her morning tea. The wedding was cancelled before the ambulance even arrived. Nicole spent 3 days at her mother's bedside, holding her hand, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Eleanor's eyes had fluttered open only once in those final hours, her voice barely audible, her words slow and deliberate. "Never confuse kindness with weakness, Nicole." That was all she said. And then she was gone. The funeral was small. Tasteful. Eleanor would have approved. Neighbors spoke fondly of her generosity. The pastor mentioned her quiet faith. Bubble, Nicole's elder sister, stood beside her throughout the service, her hand resting lightly on Nicole's shoulder, a gesture that might have looked like comfort to anyone watching. But Nicole felt the weight of it differently. Harold, Nicole's husband of 2 years, stood a few feet away, his face composed, his posture upright. He didn't cry. He didn't reach for her hand. He simply stood there, present but distant, as though attending out of obligation rather than love. Nicole told herself it was grief. That everyone processes loss differently. She told herself he just needed time. She was wrong. For days after the funeral, Nicole returned to the estate where she and Harold had planned to live after the wedding. It was a beautiful property, sprawling, elegant, with a long circular driveway framed by magnolia trees. Harold had been so proud when they'd first walked through it together, talking about their future, their children, the life they would build. But when Nicole arrived that afternoon, something felt wrong. The front door was locked. Her key didn't work. She stood there for a moment, confused, her phone already in her hand to call Harold, when she heard the sound of footsteps on gravel behind her. She turned. And there they were. Harold and Bubble, walking toward her. Together. Harold's hand was resting lightly on Bubble's lower back. Bubble's eyes were forward, calm, composed. She wasn't ashamed. She wasn't apologetic. She looked settled. Nicole's heart didn't race. It didn't pound. It simply stopped for a moment, as if her body needed time to catch up with what her mind was beginning to understand. Harold stopped a few feet away. He didn't come closer. He didn't hug her. He simply looked at her with the same detached professionalism he might use in a business meeting. "Nicole," he said quietly, "we need to talk." She didn't respond. She couldn't. He continued, his voice steady, rehearsed. "I filed for divorce. The papers will be delivered tomorrow. I'm moving forward with Bubble. We're getting married next month." The words hung in the air like smoke. Nicole's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at Bubble, her sister, her blood, and waited for something. Denial. Explanation. Regret. But Bubble just stood there, her expression unreadable, her silence louder than any confession. Harold shifted his weight, uncomfortable now, eager to finish. "You'll be fine, Nicole. You always land on your feet." And then he turned. And Bubble turned with him. And they walked back toward the house, their house now apparently, leaving Nicole standing alone in the driveway, still dressed in black from her mother's funeral, still holding the keys that no longer worked. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stood there, watching them disappear inside, the door closing softly behind them. And then, slowly, she sank to her knees. There were cardboard boxes stacked near the garage, her things, packed up and waiting for her to take them away. Her clothes. Her books. The small life she'd tried to build here, now reduced to something disposable. Nicole reached for the nearest box and pulled it toward her, her hands trembling slightly as she began to sort through it. Her mind was blank. Numb. Empty. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the shock and the humiliation and the unbearable weight of betrayal, a single sentence echoed. Her mother's voice. Clear. Certain. Never confuse kindness with weakness. Nicole didn't know what it meant yet. But she would. What Nicole didn't understand in that moment, what she couldn't have known as she knelt alone in that driveway, was that this betrayal had not begun 4 days ago. It had been years in the making. And the seeds of it had been planted long before Harold ever entered the picture. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the sisters. You have to understand Bubble. And you have to understand the invisible war that had been quietly unfolding inside the Bannon family for Nicole's entire life. Some rivalries are loud. They announce themselves in slammed doors and shouted accusations, in broken dishes and tears that everyone can see. But the rivalry between Nicole and Bubble Bannon had never been that kind. It had always been quieter, subtler. The kind that lives in glances across dinner tables and unspoken comparisons that no one ever names out loud. The kind that cuts deeper precisely because it's never acknowledged. Growing up in Montgomery, the Bannon sisters had been a study in contrasts. Bubble, born Barbara Jean but nicknamed Bubble by their father before he passed, was the kind of girl people noticed. Outspoken. Confident. The first to raise her hand in class, the first to volunteer for leadership roles, the first to speak up when something wasn't fair. She had inherited their father's boldness, his charm, his ability to command a room without even trying. Teachers loved her. Neighbors praised her. Eleanor smiled quietly whenever someone complimented Bubble's initiative, her drive, her natural ability to lead. And Nicole? Nicole had been the one standing slightly behind, watching. She wasn't shy, exactly. She simply preferred to listen before speaking, to observe before acting, to think before deciding. Where Bubble burned bright and fast, Nicole moved slowly, carefully, with a kind of precision that most people mistook for passivity. Eleanor had raised them differently, intentionally so. She gave Bubble freedom, responsibility, leadership opportunities. She let her make decisions, make mistakes, make noise. But with Nicole, Eleanor had been quieter, more deliberate. She didn't push Nicole into the spotlight. Instead, she taught her to watch, to listen, to notice what others missed. Strength doesn't always announce itself, Nicole, Eleanor had told her once, when Nicole was maybe 13, sitting at the kitchen table while Bubble held court at a youth leadership meeting across town. Sometimes the loudest person in the room is just filling space. But the quietest one? She's the one deciding what matters. Nicole hadn't understood it then. She'd only felt overlooked. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible in your own family, go ahead and drop a comment below. I want you to know, you're not alone. Sometimes the people who see the most are the ones no one's paying attention to. And that's not weakness. That's preparation. As they grew older, the imbalance became more pronounced. Bubble assumed, naturally easily, that she would inherit everything. Not because Eleanor had ever promised it, but because it simply made sense. She was the eldest, the most visible, the one who carried the family name with confidence and flair. She spoke often about what she would do when the time came. How she would modernize the family's modest investments. How she would expand Eleanor's quiet philanthropic work into something with real impact, real visibility. Eleanor never corrected her. But she never confirmed it, either. Nicole, meanwhile, had long since stopped expecting anything. She'd learned early that in the Bannon household, silence wasn't rejection, it was strategy. And Eleanor's silence around inheritance had always felt intentional, even if Nicole couldn't yet name why. So when Nicole met Harold Reeves at a charity gala 3 years ago, she hadn't seen him as a prize to be won or a status symbol to be claimed. She'd simply seen a man who seemed interested in her. Harold was handsome, yes. Polished. Ambitious. He worked in commercial real estate development and spoke passionately about urban revitalization, about transforming neglected neighborhoods into thriving communities. He was charming in that effortless way some men are, attentive without being overbearing, confident without being arrogant. At least, that's how it had seemed. What Nicole hadn't noticed, what she'd been too hopeful, too willing to believe in, was how often Harold's questions circled back to her family. To Eleanor. To the Bannon name and its quiet reputation in certain circles. And she definitely hadn't noticed how quickly Bubble had inserted herself into their relationship. It had started innocently enough. Bubble offering to help plan their engagement party. Bubble suggesting vendors for the wedding. Bubble stopping by their apartment unannounced, always with some small gift or helpful suggestion, always positioning herself as the supportive older sister who just wanted Nicole to be happy. Harold had welcomed it. Encouraged it, even. "Your sister's amazing," he'd said more than once, his tone warm and genuine. "You're lucky to have someone so invested in your life." And Nicole, eager to believe that her sister's presence was truly about love and not control, had smiled and agreed. She'd ignored the way Bubble's hand lingered on Harold's arm during conversations. She dismissed the private jokes they developed, the ones Nicole wasn't part of. She'd told herself it was normal. That families blended. That Harold was just being kind. But looking back now, kneeling in that driveway with her life packed into cardboard boxes, Nicole could see it clearly. The way Bubble had slowly, carefully positioned herself not as Nicole's sister, but as Harold's confidant. The way she'd made herself indispensable to him, always available, always understanding, always offering the kind of validation that Nicole, quiet, reflective Nicole, hadn't known he needed. Harold's ambition hadn't been about building communities. It had been about building access. And Bubble? Bubble had always believed that access was hers by birthright. What Nicole understood now, in a way that made her stomach turn, was that Harold had never loved her. He'd loved what he thought she represented. And when it became clear that Bubble might represent it better, might offer him more visibility, more control, more of whatever he thought the Bannon name could provide, he'd simply made the trade. Calculated. Clean. Efficient. The emotional triangulation had been so subtle, so carefully executed, that Nicole hadn't even recognized it as betrayal until it was already complete. Bubble had positioned herself as supportive, as loving, as the sister who only wanted what was best. But what she'd actually wanted was what she'd always wanted. To be first. To be chosen. To prove that seniority mattered more than anything Eleanor might have quietly valued in Nicole. Nicole sat back on her heels in the driveway, her hands resting on the edge of a half-packed box, her mind racing backward through every moment she'd dismissed, every warning sign she'd explained away. The betrayal hadn't started 4 days ago. It hadn't even started when Harold filed for divorce. It had started years ago, in 1,000 small moments Nicole had been too kind, or too naive to name. Bubble hadn't stolen Harold. She'd been positioning herself to take him all along. And Harold? Harold had let her. Because to him, Nicole had never been a person. She'd been a miscalculation. What none of them knew, not Bubble, not Harold, not even the neighbors who whispered about the scandal over Sunday brunch, was that Eleanor Bannon had spent the last decade of her life preparing for exactly this kind of betrayal. She'd watched her daughters carefully. She'd studied Harold even more carefully. And she'd made decisions that wouldn't be revealed in any public will or courtroom reading. 3 days after Nicole was left kneeling in that driveway, she received a phone call from a law firm she'd never heard of. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, discreet. "Ms. Bannon, we represent your mother's estate. There are some matters that require your immediate attention. Matters that were never intended to be made public." Nicole's hands had gone cold. What kind of matters? The attorney paused, choosing his words carefully. "The kind that will change everything you think you know about your mother, and everything they think they know about you. There are secrets that die with people. And then there are secrets that only come alive after they're gone." Eleanor Bannon's secrets belonged to the second category. The law firm was located in a building Nicole had passed 100 times but never really noticed. One of those older structures in downtown Montgomery with brass fixtures and marble floors that spoke of old money and older discretion. The kind of place that didn't advertise. Didn't need to. The kind of place that existed specifically to handle matters that were never meant to be public. Nicole arrived on a Tuesday morning, still numb, still processing the wreckage of her life. She'd spent the previous 3 days in a hotel room she could barely afford, alternating between staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment that had led her to that driveway. She didn't know what to expect from this meeting. Part of her assumed it would be procedural. A final signature. Some small bequest her mother had left, a piece of jewelry, perhaps, or a modest savings account. She wasn't prepared for what actually waited inside. The conference room was small, private, soundproofed, Nicole would later learn. A long mahogany table sat in the center, surrounded by leather chairs that looked like they'd been there since before she was born. 3 people were already seated when she entered. 2 men in tailored suits, one older, silver-haired, with a kind of calm authority that comes from decades of handling sensitive matters, the other younger, sharper, with a leather portfolio open in front of him. And one woman, perhaps in her 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a flawless bun and eyes that assessed Nicole the moment she walked through the door. The older man stood, extending his hand. "Ms. Bannon, thank you for coming. I'm Richard Calloway. I've been your mother's primary estate attorney for the past 18 years. 18 years. Nicole blinked. She'd never heard this man's name before in her life. She shook his hand, her voice quieter than she intended. I didn't know my mother had an estate attorney." Calloway's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been sympathy, or perhaps respect. "Your mother was very deliberate about what she shared, Ms. Bannon. And with whom?" He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please, sit. We have a great deal to discuss." Nicole sat. The woman with the steel-gray hair slid a leather-bound folder across the table. No words. No introduction. Just the folder, placed precisely in front of Nicole. Calloway folded his hands on the table, his voice measured, almost gentle. "Ms. Bannon, what I'm about to tell you will likely be difficult to process. Your mother spent many years ensuring that this information remained private. Not out of shame. Not out of secrecy for secrecy's sake. But because she understood that visibility can be a liability." Nicole's throat tightened. "I don't understand." Calloway nodded slowly. "Your mother, Eleanor Bannon, was not the woman most people believed her to be." He paused, letting the weight of that sentence settle. Publicly, she lived modestly. She drove an old car. She volunteered. She attended church. She donated quietly to local causes. And all of that was true. She did those things. But they were not the whole picture. The younger attorney opened his portfolio and slid a single document toward Nicole. It was a financial summary. Dense. Technical. Filled with terms Nicole barely recognized. But there was one number at the bottom that didn't require translation. Total consolidated value, $1.27 trillion US. Nicole stared at it. Her brain refused to process it. She looked up, her voice barely a whisper. This can't be real." The woman with the gray hair spoke for the first time, her tone crisp, unemotional. "It's real, Ms. Bannon. Your mother controlled interlocking trusts across 14 jurisdictions. Energy, logistics, commercial real estate, private equity structures designed to operate outside public markets. She built an empire that most people will never know existed. And she did it intentionally. If you're watching this and your mind is spinning right now, same. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever discovered something about someone you loved that completely changed how you saw them? Because that's exactly where Nicole is right now. Nicole's hands trembled as she pulled the document closer. Page after page of holdings. Entities. Subsidiaries. Trusts within trusts. Financial architecture so complex it would take her months, maybe years, to fully understand. Calloway leaned forward slightly. Your mother didn't live small because she had to, Ms. Bannon. She lived small because she chose to. Visibility attracts attention. Attention attracts risk. She understood that wealth of this magnitude is not something you display. It's something you protect. Nicole's voice cracked. Why didn't she tell me? Because, the woman said quietly, she was waiting to see who you would become. The room went silent. Calloway continued, his tone softer now. Eleanor spent years observing both of her daughters. She loved you both. But love and trust are not the same thing. And neither is love and capability. He gestured toward the folder. She chose you, Nicole. Not because you were louder. Not because you demanded it. But because you demonstrated something she valued more than ambition. What? Nicole whispered. Restraint, the woman said simply. Discernment. The ability to listen before acting. To observe before deciding. Your mother didn't need an heir who would spend this fortune. She needed an heir who would steward it. Nicole felt tears sting her eyes, but they didn't fall. Calloway slid another document across the table, this one handwritten, in Eleanor's unmistakable script. Nicole recognized it immediately. Her mother's handwriting. Her careful, deliberate penmanship. The letter was short. Nicole's hands shook as she set the letter down. She looked up at the three people watching her, their expressions unreadable. Calloway spoke quietly. You now have sole discretionary authority over the entire structure, Ms. Bannon. Nothing moves without your approval. Nothing is released without your signature. Your mother built this system to be invisible, and to be completely under your control. The younger attorney slid a pen across the table. There are some preliminary documents that require your acknowledgement. Nothing binding. Just confirmation that you've been briefed and understand the scope. Nicole stared at the pen. At the documents. At the letter in her mother's handwriting. Her mind was a whirlwind of grief and shock and something else. Something she couldn't yet name. Calloway's voice cut through the silence, calm and steady. Ms. Bannon, I know this is overwhelming. But we do need to begin making some decisions. There are structures in place that require oversight. Agreements that need renewal or revision. Your mother managed all of this quietly, but now that responsibility falls to you. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. So I have to ask, how would you like to proceed? Nicole's throat was dry. She looked down at the letter again. At her mother's words. Timing. She looked back up at Calloway, her voice barely audible. I need time. Calloway nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Of course. Take whatever time you need. But understand, the clock is already moving. And the people in your life who made certain assumptions about your future? They're moving too. Nicole stood slowly, her legs unsteady. How much time do I have? The woman with the gray hair stood as well, her expression unreadable. As much as you need, Ms. Bannon. But not a moment more than you can afford. Nicole left the building in a daze, the leather folder tucked under her arm, her mother's letter folded carefully in her pocket. The sunlight felt too bright. The street noise too loud. Everything had changed. And yet, nothing had. Harold and Bubble were still living in that house. Still planning their wedding. Still assuming Nicole had been left with nothing. But what Nicole now understood, what was beginning to settle into her bones like cold, clear water, was that her mother had seen this coming. All of it. And she had prepared accordingly. The question now wasn't whether Nicole had been betrayed. It was what she was going to do about it. And whether the people who had humiliated her were ready for the woman her mother had been quietly training her to become. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from learning you were never the story. You were just the obstacle. Nicole spent the first 2 days after the meeting in a fog of disbelief, the leather folder sitting unopened on the hotel nightstand like a loaded gun she wasn't yet ready to fire. She'd left Calloway's office with more questions than answers, her mind struggling to reconcile the mother she'd known, quiet, modest, unassuming, with the architect of a trillion-dollar empire that operated in the shadows. But it was the letter that kept pulling her back. Observation. Watch carefully before you act. So Nicole decided to watch. She started small. Carefully. The way her mother had taught her, even if Nicole hadn't fully understood the lessons at the time. She began by reviewing the documents the attorneys had given her, not the financial summaries or trust structures, but the supplementary materials. Background research. Due diligence reports. The kind of paperwork that gets filed away and forgotten. Except Eleanor hadn't forgotten anything. Buried in a manila envelope marked personal correspondence. Retained for reference were copies of emails, text messages, and meeting notes that Eleanor's attorneys had quietly preserved. At first, Nicole didn't understand why they'd been included. Then she started reading. And her blood went cold. The first document was an email exchange between Harold and a law firm in Birmingham, not Calloway's firm, but a different one. A family law practice that specialized in high-net-worth divorces. The date stamp made Nicole's stomach turn. March 14th. 6 weeks before Eleanor died. The email was polite, professional, but the content was unmistakable. Harold had been inquiring about divorce procedures in Alabama. Specifically, about asset protection strategies in cases where one spouse might be expecting a substantial inheritance. The attorney's response had been thorough, clinical. It outlined best practices for timing, for documentation, for ensuring that inherited assets remained separate property and couldn't be claimed in a settlement. Harold had replied with a single question. If the inheritance goes to someone else in the family, does that change the strategy? Nicole read the email 3 times, her hands shaking. He'd been planning this. Not after Eleanor died. Before. If you've ever found proof that someone you loved was planning to leave you before they even had the decency to tell you, I see you. Drop a comment if you know what that feels like. Because this is betrayal on a level most people can't even imagine. Nicole kept reading. The next document was a financial forecast, a projection Harold had commissioned from a consultant, estimating the potential value of Eleanor's estate based on publicly available property records and assumed investment portfolios. The numbers were wildly inaccurate, of course. Harold had assumed Eleanor was worth maybe 20 or 30 million. Comfortable. Respectable. Enough to build on. But what made Nicole's chest tighten wasn't the miscalculation. It was the notation at the bottom of the page, handwritten in Harold's unmistakable scrawl. Likely heir, Barbara, Bubble. Eldest. Established relationship. More accessible. More accessible. Nicole set the document down, her vision blurring. She'd been replaced before she was even gone. Not because Harold loved Bubble more, but because Bubble was a better investment. The next file was even worse. It was a series of text messages between Harold and Bubble, extracted from phone records that Eleanor's investigators had somehow obtained. Nicole didn't want to know how. She was just grateful they existed. The messages stretched back 8 months. Long before Eleanor got sick. Long before Nicole had any reason to suspect anything was wrong. They started innocuously enough, Bubble checking in on wedding plans, offering to help, positioning herself as the supportive sister. But by February, the tone had shifted. Bubble, she doesn't see you the way I do. She doesn't understand what you're capable of. Harold, I know. But timing matters. I can't just walk away without a plan. Bubble, you won't have to. When the time comes, I'll make sure you're taken care of. Harold, what about Nicole? Bubble, Nicole will be fine. She always lands on her feet. That's what Mom always says. Nicole's breath caught. Those were the exact words Harold had used in the driveway. You'll be fine. You always land on your feet. He hadn't even bothered to come up with his own line. He'd recycled Bubbles. The messages continued, growing bolder as Eleanor's health declined. Harold, what if the estate doesn't go the way we think? Bubble, it will. I'm the eldest. Mom knows how these things work. Nicole might get something, but the real assets will come to me. They always do. Harold, and you're sure about this? About us? Bubble, I've never been more sure of anything. You deserve someone who can actually give you the life you want. And I deserve to be chosen for once instead of overlooked. Nicole closed the file, her hands trembling so badly she had to set it down. It wasn't love. It had never been love. It was strategy. Harold had seen an opportunity and taken it. Bubble had seen a chance to prove she was first, finally, definitively, and seized it. And Nicole? Nicole had been collateral damage in a transaction she hadn't even known was happening. The final document in the folder was a single-page printout. A voicemail transcription, time-stamped 2 days after Eleanor's funeral. It was from Bubble to Harold. The words were short, blunt, void of any pretense. I did what I had to do. She'll survive. She always does. But you and me? We're going to have everything we were supposed to have. Don't feel guilty. This is just how life works. Nicole stared at the page until the words blurred together. I did what I had to do. That was Bubble's justification. Not remorse. Not conflict. Not even acknowledgement that what she'd done was cruel. Just cold, simple pragmatism. This is just how life works. Nicole sat back against the hotel headboard, the documents scattered across the bed like shrapnel. Her chest felt hollow. Not with grief. Grief had already passed. This was something colder. Sharper. Clarity. She'd spent years trying to understand why she was never enough for Bubble. Why her sister had always looked at her with something that wasn't quite love and wasn't quite resentment, something in between that Nicole had never been able to name. Now she understood. Bubble had never seen her as a sister. She'd seen her as competition. And Harold had never seen her as a wife. He'd seen her as a miscalculation. Nicole stood slowly, gathering the documents and sliding them back into the folder with deliberate care. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Silence. Do not announce what you have. She thought about calling Bubble. Confronting her. Demanding an explanation, even though the explanation was already written in black and white across a dozen damning pages. She thought about calling Harold. Asking him how long he'd been planning to leave. Whether he'd ever loved her at all, or if she'd just been a placeholder until someone better came along. But then she stopped. Because confrontation required an audience. And Nicole was done performing. Her mother had taught her something Bubble had never learned. Power doesn't announce itself. It waits. Nicole placed the folder back on the nightstand, her decision solidifying like ice over still water. She wouldn't call. She wouldn't confront. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing she'd found out. Let them think she was broken. Let them think she was irrelevant. Let them build their life on a foundation they didn't realize was already crumbling. Because silence wasn't weakness. Silence was strategy. And Nicole had just inherited an empire built on it. What Harold and Bubble didn't know, what they couldn't have known as they settled into their new life together, convinced they'd won, was that Nicole wasn't grieving anymore. She was studying. Learning the systems her mother had built. Understanding the levers of power that had been quietly transferred into her hands. And discovering that the empire Eleanor had left her wasn't just wealth. It was leverage. The kind that could support a life. Or quietly withdraw it. Nicole had asked for time. Now she was going to use it. Not to plan revenge. But to understand exactly how much control she actually had. And whether the people who'd betrayed her had any idea how deeply they'd miscalculated. There's a difference between having power and understanding it. Eleanor Bannon had understood that distinction her entire life. And now, in the quiet weeks following her funeral, Nicole was beginning to understand it too. The learning curve was steep. Not because the systems were intentionally complicated, though they were, but because they required a complete rewiring of how Nicole thought about influence, control, and consequence. Her mother had built an empire that didn't function like the ones you read about in business magazines. There were no board meetings. No earnings calls. No press releases announcing acquisitions or expansions. Eleanor's empire was architectural. It existed in the infrastructure beneath other people's success. In the financing that made projects possible. In the holding companies that owned the entities that owned the buildings. In the trusts that held the notes that funded the loans that kept businesses running. It was invisible by design. And now it belonged to Nicole. Calloway had arranged for her to meet with a small team of advisors, people who'd worked with Eleanor for years, managing the quiet machinery of her holdings. They were discreet. Professional. The kind of people who understood that the most important work happens in rooms no one knows exist. The first meeting took place in a private office in Atlanta, far enough from Montgomery that Nicole wouldn't risk being seen. She arrived early, still trying to wrap her mind around what she'd inherited. The lead advisor was a woman named Victoria Marsh, late 50s, impeccably dressed, with a kind of controlled intensity that came from decades of managing billions without anyone noticing. She'd been Eleanor's right hand for nearly 20 years. She greeted Nicole with a firm handshake and a slight smile that seemed to acknowledge both the absurdity and the gravity of the situation. "Your mother spoke of you often, Ms. Bannon. She believed you were ready for this, even if you didn't know it yet." Nicole wasn't sure she agreed, but she nodded anyway. Victoria gestured to the chair across from her. "Let's start with the basics. What your mother built wasn't designed to be flashy. It was designed to be foundational. Do you understand the difference?" Nicole hesitated. "I think so." Victoria opened a slim tablet and pulled up a diagram, a web of interconnected entities, color-coded and labeled. Most people think power is about owning things directly. A building, a company, a brand. But direct ownership is visible. It can be taxed, challenged, contested. Your mother understood that real power is structural. It's not about what you own. It's about what depends on you. She zoomed in on one section of the diagram. Take this, for example. Harold's current development project in downtown Montgomery. The luxury mixed-use complex he's been promoting for the past year. Nicole's stomach tightened at the mention of Harold's name. Victoria continued, her tone neutral. He didn't finance that project through a traditional bank. He went through a private lending consortium. What he doesn't know is that the consortium is owned by a holding company based in Delaware. And that holding company is controlled by a trust registered in the Cayman Islands. And that trust is mine, Nicole whispered. Victoria nodded. Correct. Your mother structured it that way intentionally. Harold has no idea that the money funding his entire project flows through an entity you now control. To him, it's just private capital. Anonymous investors. But to you? It's leverage. Nicole stared at the screen, her mind racing. And bubble. Victoria swiped to a different section of the diagram. Your sister's lifestyle is funded by what she believes is a modest family trust your mother set up years ago. Monthly distributions. Enough to maintain appearances. What she doesn't realize is that the trust is discretionary, meaning the distributions aren't guaranteed. They're approved. By the trustee. Who is? Victoria's expression didn't change. You. If you're watching this and just realize that power doesn't always look like power, you're getting it. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one no one's paying attention to. Drop a like if this is clicking for you, because it's about to get even deeper. Nicole leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. Victoria set the tablet down and folded her hands on the desk. Here's what you need to understand, Ms. Bannon. Your mother didn't leave you a fortune to spend. She left you a system. And that system touches more lives than you realize. Harold's investors. Bubble's credit lines. The contractors working on projects they think are independently funded. The vendors who've extended terms based on assumptions about liquidity. She paused, letting that sink in. Power isn't force. It's not about destroying something in a single dramatic move. Real power is withdrawal. It's the quiet removal of support that people didn't realize they were standing on. Nicole's throat was dry. So I could just stop it? All of it? Victoria's expression was unreadable. Technically, yes. You could trigger a cascade that would unravel everything Harold's built and everything Bubble depends on. But that's not what your mother would have done. Why not? Because, Victoria said quietly, she understood timing. If you act too quickly, you give them a chance to recover, to adapt, to find alternative funding or support. But if you let them settle into their new life, let them believe they've won, let them make commitments based on assumptions that no longer hold, then when the foundation shifts, there's nowhere left to go. Nicole swallowed hard. So what do I do? Victoria leaned forward slightly. You watch. You learn. You let the system show you where the pressure points are. And when the moment is right, not a moment before, you make one decision. One instruction. and everything changes. She pulled up another screen, this one showing a series of agreements, loans, and obligations tied to Harold's projects. Right now, Harold is overextended. He's betting on future distributions from financing he believes is secure. He's made promises to investors based on timelines he thinks are guaranteed. But those timelines depend on approvals that now require your signature. Nicole stared at the screen, the implications slowly crystallizing. If I delay those approvals, nothing collapses, Victoria said. Not immediately. But deadlines get missed. Investors get nervous. Contractors start asking questions. And Harold starts realizing that something is wrong, but he won't know what. Or who. Nicole's pulse quickened. Victoria swiped to another document. And Bubbles' distributions from the family trust? They're set to renew quarterly. The next one is scheduled for 60 days from now. It's not a large amount individually, but it's foundational to how she's structured her expenses. Credit payments, lease agreements, monthly obligations. She looked up at Nicole. If that distribution doesn't come through, or comes through late or reduced, it won't destroy her. But it will destabilize her. Quietly. Invisibly. In ways she won't be able to explain to Harold or justify to herself. Nicole felt something shift inside her, something cold and clear and impossibly calm. This wasn't revenge. It was architecture. Her mother hadn't left her weapons. She'd left her blueprints. And the people who'd betrayed her had built their entire future on a foundation they didn't control. Victoria closed the tablet and looked at Nicole directly. The question isn't whether you have power, Ms. Bannon. You do. The question is what you're going to do with it. And more importantly, when. Nicole sat in silence for a long moment, her mind cycling through everything she just learned. She thought about Harold in that driveway, so certain she'd be fine. She thought about Bubbles' text message, I did what I had to do. She thought about her mother's letter. Timing. Do not rush. Victoria watched her carefully, waiting. Finally, Nicole spoke, her voice steady. What happens if I do nothing? Right now, I mean. If I just let everything continue as it is. Victoria's expression softened slightly. Then nothing changes. The approvals continue. The distributions continue. Harold builds his projects. Bubble lives her life. And you remain invisible. But I'd still have control. Always, Victoria confirmed. The system doesn't disappear just because you're not using it. It waits. Until you're ready. Nicole exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision settling over her like a heavy coat she wasn't sure she wanted to wear. But she was going to wear it anyway. Because her mother had spent 18 years building this. And Nicole wasn't going to waste it by acting too soon. Victoria stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Take your time, Ms. Bannon. Think about what you want. Not what they deserve, what you want. And when you know, we'll be ready. Nicole stood as well, shaking Victoria's hand. How will I know? She asked quietly. When it's time. Victoria's smile was small but knowing. You'll know. Because the anger will be gone. And all that will be left is clarity. Nicole left the office and walked slowly back to her car, the Atlanta skyline stretching out before her like a promise she wasn't sure she was ready to keep. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. She opened it. It was a photo, Harold and Bubble at a restaurant, smiling, his arm around her shoulders, both of them looking relaxed and happy. Below the image, a single line of text. Thought you'd want to see how well they're doing. Nicole stared at the photo for a long moment. Then she deleted it. Not out of pain. Out of focus. Because they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what she was becoming. And whether she was ready to use what her mother had given her. She sat in the car, hands resting on the steering wheel, her mother's voice echoing in her mind. Observation. Silence. Timing. A text came through from Victoria. Ready when you are. Nicole typed a single word in response. Not yet. She hit send. And drove away. But not yet didn't mean never. It just meant Nicole was still watching. Still learning. Still letting Harold and Bubble settle into the life they thought they'd won. And in the weeks that followed, as spring turned to summer and their wedding plans took shape, small things began to shift. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just tiny delays. Minor complications. Questions that took longer to answer than they should have. The kind of friction that's easy to dismiss. Until it isn't. The first crack in Harold's confidence appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in late June. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even particularly noticeable to anyone outside his immediate circle. But Harold noticed. He'd been waiting on a routine approval for a construction draw, $2.3 million to cover the next phase of his downtown Montgomery project. Foundation work. Steel framing. Labor costs that couldn't be delayed without triggering penalty clauses in half a dozen subcontracts. The approval process had always been smooth. Predictable. He'd submit the request, provide documentation, and within 72 hours the funds would clear. It was a system he'd come to rely on. But this time, 72 hours came and went. Then 96. Then a full week. Harold called the contact number he'd been given when the financing was first arranged, a private investment group that handled high-net-worth projects with minimal red tape. The voice on the other end was polite. Professional. Unhelpful. "We're just waiting on final authorization from the fund manager, Mr. Reeves. It should be processed shortly." Harold frowned. "This has never taken this long before. Is there a problem with the documentation?" "Not at all. Everything looks fine on our end. Sometimes these things just take a bit longer depending on internal review cycles." "Internal review cycles," Harold repeated slowly. "Since when do you have internal review cycles?" A pause. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Reeves. I'll follow up and see if we can expedite." The call ended. Harold set his phone down, irritation simmering beneath his calm exterior. It was probably nothing. A bureaucratic hiccup. A new compliance protocol. But still, it nagged at him. By the end of the week, the approval still hadn't come through. And his general contractor was starting to ask questions. Harold reassured him it was just a processing delay. That the money was guaranteed. That there was nothing to worry about. But privately, for the first time in months, Harold felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since before Eleanor died. Uncertainty. If you've ever had something that always worked suddenly stop working, and you couldn't figure out why, you know how unsettling that feels. Drop a comment if you've been there. Because that's exactly where Harold is right now. And it's only going to get worse. Meanwhile, Bubble was dealing with her own quiet unraveling. It had started small. A credit card decline at a boutique in Birmingham. Embarrassing, but easily explained as a fraud alert. The charge went through on the second try. Then a delayed payment from a family trust, normally deposited on the 1st of the month, now arriving on the 8th with no explanation. It wasn't a significant amount. $15,000. Enough to cover her monthly obligations, car lease, club membership, personal expenses. But the delay had thrown off her autopay schedule, triggering late fees on 2 accounts. Bubble had called the trust administrator, annoyed. The voice on the other end had been apologetic but vague. There was a minor administrative hold while some trustee transitions were finalized. Everything's been resolved now. Future distributions should process normally. Bubble had accepted the explanation, but it left her unsettled. Trustee transitions? Eleanor had been dead for 2 months. Shouldn't that have been handled already? She didn't mention it to Harold. There was no point worrying him over what was clearly just a clerical issue. But when her hairstylist mentioned in passing that her usual standing appointment might need to be adjusted because the salon's credit system had flagged her account for review, Bubble felt something tighten in her chest. "Flagged for what?" she'd asked, keeping her tone light. The stylist had looked uncomfortable. "I'm not sure, hon. It just said to verify payment method on file. Probably nothing. You know how these systems are." Bubble had smiled and updated her card information, but the conversation stayed with her. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But for the first time since marrying Harold, Bubble felt a whisper of instability she couldn't quite name. By mid-July, the tension had spread. Harold's project delays had compounded. The construction draw finally came through, 11 days late, but by then he'd had to scramble to keep subcontractors from walking off the job. He'd paid penalties out of pocket to maintain goodwill, draining his operating reserves faster than he'd anticipated. Then another approval got delayed. This time for permits tied to utility connections, permits that required sign-off from an infrastructure holding company Harold had never heard of but that apparently had jurisdiction over the site. He'd spent 3 days trying to get someone on the phone who could explain why the approval was stalled. When he finally reached a representative, the answer had been maddeningly vague. We're experiencing higher than normal application volume. Your request is in queue. How long? Hard to say. Could be a few days. Could be longer. Harold had hung up, frustration boiling over. Nothing was broken. But nothing was flowing the way it used to. It was like trying to run through waist-deep water. Every step took twice the effort and produced half the result. And he couldn't figure out why. Bubble, meanwhile, had started noticing social shifts. Small things. A lunch invitation from a friend that got postponed indefinitely. A charity event she'd assumed she'd be invited to, one she'd attended every year, where the invitation never came. A subtle coolness from people who used to greet her warmly. It wasn't overt. No one was rude. No one confronted her. But the texture of her social world had changed, like a fabric that had been stretched just slightly out of shape. She mentioned it to Harold one night over dinner, trying to keep her tone casual. Do you think people are, I don't know, acting strange lately? Harold looked up from his phone, distracted. What do you mean? I don't know. Just little things. Like people aren't as warm as they used to be. Harold shrugged. You married your sister's ex-husband, Bubble. People talk. Give it time. They'll get over it. She wanted to argue, but she didn't. Because part of her knew he was right. And part of her wondered if there was something else going on that she couldn't see. Late one night, unable to sleep, Harold pulled up his project financials on his laptop. Everything looked fine on paper. The numbers added up. The projections held. The financing was in place. But the pace had changed. Everything was taking longer. Costing more. Requiring more follow-up than it should. He ran scenarios in his head, trying to identify the common thread. Was it the lenders? The city? The contractors? He couldn't pinpoint it. And that was what bothered him most. There was no visible enemy. No obvious problem to solve. Just a creeping sense that the systems he'd relied on were no longer operating in his favor. He closed the laptop and stared out the window at the Montgomery skyline. For the first time since leaving Nicole, Harold felt a flicker of something he didn't want to acknowledge. Doubt. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like things were falling apart but you couldn't figure out why, that's the kind of psychological pressure that breaks people. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see how this plays out. Because Nicole? She's just getting started. Across town, in a quiet hotel suite Nicole had rented under a corporate account no one could trace back to her, she sat with her laptop open. Victoria had sent her a weekly summary, nothing detailed, just a high-level overview of key activities across the portfolio. Most of it was routine. But 2 items had been flagged for her attention. The first, Harold's construction draw request, which had been approved after a standard review delay. The second, Bubble's trust distribution, which had been processed on schedule after a brief administrative hold. Nothing significant. Nothing punitive. Just minor friction. The kind that wouldn't raise alarms but would create just enough resistance to make things harder than they used to be. Nicole stared at the screen, her mother's words echoing in her mind. Power isn't force. It's withdrawal. She wasn't destroying anything. She was just adjusting the flow. Letting Harold and Bubble experience what it felt like when the invisible support they'd taken for granted became just slightly less reliable. Her phone buzzed. A message from Victoria. Ready to proceed with Phase 2, or hold. Nicole read the message twice. Phase 2 would involve more deliberate interventions. Strategic delays that would create measurable consequences. The kind of pressure that couldn't be dismissed as bad luck or bureaucratic inefficiency. She thought about Harold in that driveway. You'll be fine. You always land on your feet. She thought about Bubble's text message. I did what I had to do. Nicole's finger hovered over the keyboard. Then she typed a single word. Hold. But after a moment, she added. One minor adjustment. Delay Bubble's next distribution by 15 days. Site routine audit review. She hit send. It wasn't revenge. It was a test. to see how they responded when the ground beneath them shifted just slightly, to see if they'd panic, or if they'd even notice. Nicole closed the laptop and leaned back against the headboard. She wasn't angry anymore. She was curious. And that, she was beginning to realize, was far more dangerous. What Nicole didn't know yet, what she was about to discover, was that minor adjustments had a way of cascading. That 15-day delay would trigger a late payment. That late payment would trigger a credit review. And that credit review would reveal something Bubble had been hiding. Something that would force Nicole to make a choice she wasn't sure she was ready for. Because power, as her mother had taught her, wasn't just about what you could do. It was about what you were willing to become. And Nicole was about to find out exactly who she was when the anger finally burned away. There are moments in life when you stop being who you were and become who you were always meant to be. For Nicole Bannon, that moment came in a secure boardroom in Nashville, Tennessee, on a sweltering afternoon in early August. She'd received the message from Victoria 3 days earlier. Short. Direct. Unavoidable. We need to meet. There are developments you need to be aware of. Thursday, 2 p.m., Nashville. Address to follow. No explanation. No details. Just the certainty that something had shifted. Nicole had driven the 2 hours from Montgomery alone, her mind cycling through possibilities, anxieties, and a growing sense that whatever waited for her in that boardroom would require a version of herself she wasn't sure existed yet. The building was nondescript, a mid-rise office tower in the business district, the kind of place that housed accounting firms and consultancies and the sort of operations that preferred not to be noticed. She took the elevator to the 14th floor. The hallway was silent, carpeted, climate-controlled to the point of sterility. At the end of the hall, a frosted glass door with no nameplate. Nicole pushed it open. Inside, the room was small but meticulously designed. Soundproofed walls. No windows. A single long table made of dark walnut, surrounded by leather chairs. 3 people were already seated. Victoria Marsh, composed as always, her expression unreadable. Richard Calloway, the estate attorney, his silver hair carefully combed, his suit impeccable. And a third person Nicole hadn't met before, a man in his early 40s, sharp-featured, with a kind of calm intensity that suggested he was used to operating in situations where mistakes had consequences. Victoria gestured to the chair across from them. Ms. Bannon. Thank you for coming. Nicole sat, her pulse steady but deliberate. What's going on? Victoria exchanged a glance with Calloway, then turned back to Nicole. We need to have a conversation about what happens next. And before we do, there are some things you need to understand about what your mother built, and why she built it the way she did. Calloway leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table. Your mother didn't just anticipate betrayal, Ms. Bannon. She designed her entire estate structure around it. Nicole's breath caught. What do you mean? The third man spoke for the first time, his voice low and precise. I'm Daniel Cross. I've been managing operational security for your mother's holdings for the past decade. My job was to monitor risks, financial, legal, and personal. Your mother understood that wealth at this scale creates vulnerabilities. And the people closest to you are often the ones most capable of exploiting them. He slid a thin folder across the table. Nicole opened it. Inside were surveillance reports, financial analyses, behavioral assessments, all focused on 2 people, Harold Reeves and Barbara Bubble Bannon. Nicole's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Cross continued, his tone clinical. Your mother began monitoring Harold 18 months before he proposed to you. She flagged him as a liability within the first 6 months. His financial history showed a pattern of leveraging relationships for access. He'd done it before, twice, with women from families that had resources he wanted. Nicole's throat tightened. She knew, and she didn't tell me. Victoria's voice was gentle but firm. She didn't tell you because she wanted you to make your own choices, to learn from your own experiences. But she also wanted to make sure that if those choices led to betrayal, you would have options. Calloway picked up the thread. Your sister was more complicated. Eleanor loved Bubble. But she also recognized certain traits: entitlement, impulsivity, a tendency to see inheritance as a right rather than a responsibility. She couldn't trust Bubble with fiduciary authority. but she also didn't want to punish her for being who she was. He paused. So she created a system where Bubble would be provided for, comfortably, but would never have control. And if Bubble ever acted against your interests, the system would automatically respond. Nicole looked up sharply. Automatically. Victoria nodded. The delays Harold has been experiencing? The instability Bubble is starting to feel? Those weren't initiated by you, Nicole. They were triggered by the system itself, based on behavioral markers your mother identified years ago. Nicole's mind reeled. What kind of markers? Cross pulled up a screen on a tablet and turned it toward her. Harold's financing is structured with conditional clauses. If certain behaviors occur, excessive leverage, undisclosed debts, attempts to access funds tied to familial relationships, the approval process automatically slows. It's not a shutdown. It's friction. Designed to create stress without creating a visible enemy. He swiped to another screen. Bubble's trust operates similarly. If distributions are used in ways that suggest financial irresponsibility, large cash withdrawals, irregular spending patterns, attempts to use the trust as collateral, the system flags it for review. Again, not punitive, just cautious. Nicole stared at the data, her heart pounding. So my mother was controlling them? Even after she died? No, Victoria said quietly. She was protecting you. There's a difference. If you're watching this and just realized how far ahead Eleanor was thinking, drop a comment. Because this is the kind of strategic planning most people can't even imagine. And it's about to get even more intense. Calloway cleared his throat. The reason we called you here today, Ms. Bannon, is because the system has reached a decision point. The safeguards your mother put in place can only go so far on automation. Beyond this point, human judgment is required. What kind of judgment? Victoria leaned forward. Bubble's next trust distribution is scheduled for 2 weeks from now. Based on recent activity, specifically, attempts to use the trust as a reference for a personal loan application, the system has flagged her account for discretionary review, meaning the distribution can proceed, be reduced, be delayed, or be suspended entirely. But that decision now requires your approval. Nicole's stomach dropped. You're asking me to decide whether to cut off my sister's income. We're asking you to decide what level of support is appropriate, Calloway corrected gently, given the circumstances. Cross added, for context, Bubble has been using trust distributions to fund a lifestyle that exceeds what those distributions were designed to cover. She's leveraging anticipated future payments to secure credit. If those payments don't materialize as expected, her financial position becomes untenable very quickly. Nicole closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a physical force. Victoria's voice cut through the silence. We're not asking you to be cruel, Nicole. We're asking you to be clear. Your mother gave you this authority because she trusted you to use it wisely. Not vengefully, but wisely. Nicole opened her eyes. And Harold? Harold's situation is similar, Cross said. His project financing is contingent on continued approvals. Those approvals are within your discretion. If you authorize them, his projects continue, slowly with friction, but they continue. If you don't, the financing dries up within 60 days. Calloway's expression was somber. Your mother designed this system to give you control, Ms. Bannon. But control means responsibility. And responsibility means deciding not just what people deserve, but what kind of person you want to be when you make that decision. The room fell silent. Nicole looked down at the folder in front of her, at the reports detailing every lie Harold had told, every calculation Bubble had made. She thought about the driveway. About the wedding that never happened. About her mother's letter. Never confuse kindness with weakness. Victoria's voice was quiet. So I'll ask you again, Ms. Bannon. How would you like to proceed? Nicole sat in silence for a long moment, her mind sifting through grief and anger and something colder clearer. She thought about who she'd been 3 months ago, the woman who would have forgiven, who would have turned the other cheek, who would have convinced herself that love meant letting go. But that woman had died in a driveway in Montgomery. And the woman sitting in this boardroom? She was someone else entirely. Nicole looked up, her voice steady. Bubble's distribution. Suspend it. Cite ongoing fiduciary review pending resolution of credit inquiries. Victoria made a note, her expression neutral. And Harold? Nicole's jaw tightened. Delay all pending approvals for 30 days. Let him scramble. Let him feel what it's like when the systems he took for granted stop working. She paused, then added, her voice colder now. And I want a full accounting of every entity he's tied to. Every loan. Every obligation. Every point of leverage we have. Because when I move again, I want to know exactly where it hurts. Calloway nodded slowly. Cross closed his tablet. Victoria met Nicole's eyes, and for the first time, something like approval flickered across her face. Understood. Nicole stood, her legs steadier than she expected. Is there anything else? Victoria shook her head. Not today. But there will be. This is just the beginning. Nicole walked to the door, then paused, her hand on the handle. She turned back. My mother knew, didn't she? She knew exactly what they would do. Victoria's smile was faint but knowing. She knew people, Ms. Bannon. And she knew you. That's why you're standing here. Nicole nodded once. Then she walked out. The instructions were transmitted within the hour. Secure. Encrypted. Irreversible. And in offices across 3 states, systems that had been running on autopilot for months quietly shifted. Approvals were placed on hold. Distributions were flagged for review. And in Montgomery, Alabama, 2 people who thought they'd won began to feel the ground shift beneath them in ways they couldn't yet name. But they would. Because Nicole Bannon was no longer the grieving daughter they'd humiliated. She was the architect of their unraveling. And she was just getting started. There's a moment between giving an order and seeing it carried out when everything hangs suspended. The decision has been made. The words have been spoken. The machinery has been set in motion. But the consequences haven't landed yet. Nicole understood that moment now, understood it the way her mother must have understood it 1,000 times before, sitting in rooms just like the one she just left, making decisions that would ripple outward in ways most people would never trace back to their source. She drove back to Montgomery as the sun set behind her, the sky bleeding orange and pink across the Alabama horizon. Her phone sat silent on the passenger seat. Victoria had promised updates. Confirmations. The kind of documentation that would prove the instructions had been received and implemented. But for now, there was only silence. And Nicole found, somewhat surprisingly, that she was at peace with it. 2 weeks passed. And in those 2 weeks, the world Harold and Bubble had built began to crack. Not shatter. Not collapse. Just crack. The kind of cracks that start small, hairline fractures in the foundation that most people wouldn't even notice. But Harold noticed. It started with phone calls that went unreturned. The investment group that had always responded within hours now took days. Then a week. Then nothing at all, just silence where there used to be eager cooperation. Harold left messages. Sent emails. Followed up with the professional persistence that had always served him well in the past. Nothing. His project timeline slipped by 2 weeks. Then 3. Then a full month. Subcontractors who'd been eager for his business were suddenly overcommit and unavailable. Permits that should have been routine were delayed for additional review. Banks that had pre-approved his credit lines were now requesting supplementary documentation, mountains of it, before they could proceed with processing. There was no single point of failure. No obvious enemy. No dramatic confrontation he could prepare for. Just resistance. Everywhere he turned. Harold stood in the half-finished skeleton of what was supposed to be his flagship development, a luxury mixed-use complex in downtown Montgomery that he'd been promoting for over a year. Steel beams rose around him like the ribs of some massive creature, exposed and vulnerable, waiting for the flesh of walls and windows that might never come. The general contractor had pulled him aside that morning, his expression uncomfortable. I need to be straight with you, Harold. My guys haven't been paid in 3 weeks. I've been floating it out of my own pocket because I believed in this project. But I can't keep doing that. If the next draw doesn't come through by Friday, I'm going to have to pause operations. Harold had assured him it would be fine. That the money was coming. That there was just a minor administrative delay. But standing here now, alone in the hollow shell of his ambition, Harold wasn't sure anymore. He pulled out his phone and tried the investment group one more time. Voicemail. Again. He hung up without leaving a message. There was no point. Bubbles' unraveling was quieter, but no less complete. It started at a restaurant in Birmingham, an upscale place where she'd taken a friend for lunch, the kind of casual extravagance that had always been part of her life. The waiter returned to the table with an apologetic expression. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. This card has been declined. Would you like to try another?" Bubble had laughed, a bright, practiced laugh designed to dismiss the moment as a minor inconvenience. Of course. Technology, right? Always glitching at the worst times. She handed over a second card. The waiter returned again, his discomfort visible. "I'm afraid this one isn't working either, ma'am." The laughter died. Bubble paid with cash, nearly emptying her wallet, and excused herself early, claiming a headache. In the parking lot, she called her bank. The representative was polite, professional, maddeningly calm. "Ma'am, there's a hold on your account pending verification of your primary income source. Until that verification is complete, your available credit has been temporarily adjusted." Adjusted to what? A pause. $500. Bubbles' hand tightened on the phone so hard her knuckles went white. "That's impossible. I have trust distributions. Regular income. There's documentation." "Yes, ma'am. The issue is that your listed income source, a family trust, has been flagged for audit. We can't verify the income until that audit is resolved. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Bubble hung up. Her hands were shaking. She called the trust administrator immediately, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I need to speak with someone about my account. There's been some kind of mistake." The voice on the other end was calm, unhurried. "Ms. Bannon, your account is currently under fiduciary review. These processes take time. We'll notify you as soon as there's a resolution." "How long?" "I can't give you a specific timeline, but rest assured, the review is being conducted thoroughly." Thoroughly? Bubbles' voice rose. "What does that even mean? This is my money. My mother set up this trust specifically for me. There's no reason for a review. There's no reason for any of this." A pause. "I understand your frustration, Ms. Bannon. But the review was initiated by the trustee's office. If you have concerns, you're welcome to submit them in writing, and they'll be addressed as part of the process." The trustee's office. Bubble didn't even know who the trustee was anymore. Her mother had always handled those details. And after Eleanor died, Bubble had assumed everything would simply continue as it always had. She'd never bothered to ask who was in charge now. She hung up the phone and sat in her car, staring at nothing. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. If you're watching this and you've ever felt that moment when everything you counted on suddenly becomes uncertain, you know how Bubble feels right now. But here's the difference. Bubble did this to herself. She just doesn't know it yet. Drop a comment if you think she's about to find out. The cracks spread. Harold's investors began asking uncomfortable questions. What's the timeline looking like now? When can we expect the next progress report? We've heard there have been some delays. Should we be concerned? Harold answered each question with confidence he no longer felt, buying time he wasn't sure he had. At night, he paced the house, the beautiful house that was supposed to represent his new beginning with Bubble, and stared at spreadsheets that no longer added up. The numbers hadn't changed. The projections were the same as they'd always been. But the systems that had always supported those numbers were no longer responding. It was like trying to run through waist-deep water. Every step took twice the effort and produced half the result. And he couldn't figure out why. Bubble watched him pace, her own anxiety mounting. "What's going on, Harold? You've been on edge for weeks." "Nothing," he said automatically. "Just some delays. It'll work itself out." But his voice was hollow. And Bubble, despite her own mounting problems, could hear the fear underneath. She didn't press him. She couldn't. Because pressing him would mean admitting that things weren't fine. And if things weren't fine for Harold, and things weren't fine for her. Bubble poured herself another glass of wine and pushed the thought away. It would work itself out. It had to. Across town, In a quiet hotel suite that no one in Montgomery knew existed, Nicole sat in darkness. She'd been tracking the developments through Victoria's reports, clinical summaries of consequences unfolding exactly as designed. Harold's financing was stalling. Bubble's credit was collapsing. The invisible architecture that had supported their ambitions was quietly, systematically withdrawing. And they had no idea why. Nicole had expected to feel satisfaction, vindication, the sweet taste of justice finally being served. But sitting here in the dark, watching the city lights flicker through the window, she felt something else entirely. Emptiness. Not the empty feeling of grief or loss. She'd moved past that weeks ago. This was different. This was the emptiness of completion. She'd done what she set out to do. She'd proven that she wasn't powerless. She'd made them feel even a fraction of the instability they'd inflicted on her. And now what? Was this all there was? Tactical maneuvers and quiet destructions, played out in the shadows while they scrambled and suffered and never understood why. Nicole stood and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. You have the power to destroy what threatens you. But you also have the power to build something they could never imagine. Build. Her mother had always been building. Not just wealth. Not just systems. Something larger. Something that would outlast her. Nicole had been so focused on the destruction, on making Harold and Bubble pay for what they'd done, that she'd forgotten to ask herself the most important question. What did she actually want? She thought about the woman she used to be. The quiet one. The observer. The one who stood slightly behind, watching while others took center stage. She'd spent her whole life being overlooked. Underestimated. Dismissed. By her sister. By her husband. By everyone who assumed that silence meant weakness. But her mother had seen something different. Eleanor had watched both her daughters grow up. She'd seen Bubble's ambition, her confidence, her easy assumption that the world owed her something. And she'd seen Nicole's patience. Her restraint. Her ability to observe without reacting, to absorb information without immediately acting on it. She'd chosen Nicole. Not because Nicole was louder. Not because she demanded it. But because she demonstrated something Eleanor valued more than ambition. The capacity to wait. The wisdom to watch. The strength to hold power without being consumed by it. Nicole let out a slow breath, the weight of that responsibility settling over her like a mantle. Her mother hadn't left her an empire to use as a weapon. She'd left her an empire to steward. To build upon. To transform into something that could outlast them both. The destruction of Harold and Bubble wasn't the point. It never had been. It was just the clearing of the ground. The real work, the work her mother had been preparing her for, was what came next. If you're still watching, and I know you are, I need you to understand something. This isn't about revenge. This is about a woman discovering who she really is when the people who were supposed to love her threw her away. And what she's about to decide. It's going to change everything. Subscribe now if you haven't already, because part 2 is coming, and you don't want to miss it. Nicole made the call the next morning. Victoria answered on the first ring. Ms. Bannon. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. I'm ready, Nicole said. But not for what you think. A pause. I'm listening. Nicole looked out the window at the Montgomery skyline, the city where she'd been humiliated, where she'd lost everything she thought she wanted, where she'd been reborn into someone she was only beginning to understand. I want complete separation, she said. Every entity tied to Harold. Every structure connected to Bubble. I want it untangled within 90 days. Clean. Permanent. No ongoing leverage. No continued entanglement. Victoria's voice was careful. That's not what I expected. You're walking away from significant control. No, Nicole said quietly. I'm walking away from them. There's a difference. Another pause. And after the separation? Then we build. I want a meeting with the full advisory board. I want to understand every holding, every entity, every piece of what my mother created. And I want to start thinking about what comes next. Not just maintaining what she built, expanding it, transforming it, making it into something that matters. She could almost hear Victoria's smile through the phone. Your mother would be proud. Nicole closed her eyes. I hope so. That night, Nicole moved. Not dramatically. Not publicly. She simply checked out of her hotel, loaded her few belongings into her car, and drove to Atlanta. She'd found an apartment there, modest by the standards of what she could afford, but clean and quiet and hers. Far enough from Montgomery to think clearly. Close enough to act when necessary. The apartment had large windows that faced the city skyline, and as Nicole stood before them on her first night, she felt something shift inside her. The grief that had defined her for months was finally fading. The anger that had followed was burning down to embers. And in their place, something new was rising. Purpose. Clarity. A sense of direction she'd never felt before. She thought about Harold, still scrambling to save a project that would never be completed. She thought about Bubble, watching her carefully constructed life crumble around her, unable to understand why. Part of her, a small human part, still felt the pull of vengeance. The desire to see them suffer more. To make them understand exactly who had done this to them and why. But that part was getting quieter. Because Nicole was beginning to understand something her mother had always known. Revenge was a destination. Once you arrived, there was nowhere else to go. But building, creating, transforming, that was a journey. One that could last a lifetime. And Nicole was finally ready to begin. The separation took exactly 90 days. Victoria's team worked with surgical precision, untangling Nicole's holdings from every entity connected to Harold or Bubble. Financing was restructured. Ownership was transferred. The invisible threads that had given Nicole control over their lives were carefully, permanently severed. When it was done, Harold and Bubble were on their own. Their problems wouldn't disappear overnight. The damage had already been done, the delays, the missed deadlines, the credit issues that would take years to fully repair. But Nicole was no longer the architect of their suffering. She was simply gone. Moved on to something larger than they could ever understand. 3 months later, Nicole sat in a conference room in Atlanta, surrounded by the advisory board her mother had assembled over decades. Victoria was there. Calloway. Daniel Cross. And a dozen others, lawyers, financiers, strategists, all of them looking at her with a mixture of respect and expectation. Nicole looked around the table at the faces of people who had devoted their careers to protecting and growing her mother's legacy. "My mother built something extraordinary," she said quietly. "She did it in silence, in shadows, without anyone ever knowing. And she left it to me, not because I asked for it, but because she believed I could be trusted with it." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "I've spent the last 6 months learning what she built, understanding how it works, and deciding what I want to do with it." She stood, walking to the window that overlooked the Atlanta skyline. "My mother taught me that power isn't about destruction. It's about creation. About building systems that work quietly, invisibly, while everyone else is looking the other way." She turned back to face them. "I'm not interested in revenge anymore. I'm not interested in punishing the people who hurt me. That chapter is closed." Victoria nodded slowly. "Then what are you interested in, Ms. Bannon?" Nicole smiled, a small private smile that carried echoes of her mother's quiet confidence. "I'm interested in building something they could never imagine. Something that outlasts all of us. Something that proves, once and for all, that the quiet woman was never the one to underestimate." She sat back down, her hands folded on the table in front of her. "So, let's begin." That night, alone in her apartment, Nicole stood at the window one last time. The city glittered below her, alive with possibility. She thought about her mother, the woman who had seen this moment coming before Nicole ever could. Who had prepared for betrayal not with bitterness, but with architecture. Who had taught her daughter, through silence and observation and patience, exactly how to become the woman she was meant to be. She thought about Harold and Bubble, smaller now, distant, like figures receding in a rearview mirror. They would survive. Or they wouldn't. Either way, it no longer concerned her. She thought about the driveway in Montgomery. The boxes. The humiliation of kneeling there in her funeral black while her husband walked away with her sister. That woman felt like a stranger now. Someone she'd known once, long ago, in another life. Nicole placed her hand against the window, feeling the cool glass beneath her palm. The grief was gone. The anger was gone. And in their place was something her mother had always promised would come. Clarity. Nicole closed her eyes and spoke the words out loud, not for anyone else, but for herself. For the woman she used to be. For the woman she had become. I've decided. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If this touched your heart, then you're going to love the next one. It's just as powerful, and even more intriguing than you can imagine. So don't stop here. Check out more videos on my channel and continue the journey. I'll be waiting for you on the other side of that story. See you there.